but I guess since we're already 10 minutes in, we might as well start up, and then whoever joins joins. And like I say, we will have the replay to go back to as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I was going to do this pretty informally. I mean, but yeah, so I wanted to first just introduce you, Cameron. So this is Cameron Cowan. Do we still talk about the Cameron Journal or not?
Well, I mean, yeah. So the current, it's very weird when you do something for 12 years and everyone knows you for that thing, and then that thing is going away. So right now, it's the ex-creative director of the Cameron Journal. Now I'm doing the story strategy and signals consultancy, where I do competitive intelligence and strategic foresight for businesses. So and people will remember me from the Cameron Journal podcast, the Cameron Journal News Hour, things like that. And now we're blazing forward into helping startups and businesses understand news in the world around them. So I'm still doing the news, just for a very different set of readers for a very different reason.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, so I wanted to have Cameron on to talk about this topic because you participated in Occupy back in the
I
day,
did.
and so we did. The Future Hindsight show did, just to kind of bring people up to kind of where we're at. The Future
Yeah.
Hindsight show did a 6-part, I think it was, series on Occupy. So they kind of revisited the 2011 protests, and they focused on Zuccotti Park and kind of what was going on in New York. And they did expand it a little bit and talked about some of the other things around, some of the after effects and impact of Occupy going forward. But so that series is out there, and you can check that on the Future Hindsights podcast. We also did a feed drop of the episode 1 of that series on our show, so that came out on our show. And then I also interviewed Mila Atmos, who is the executive producer of Future Hindsight. So I interviewed her about that series and about Occupy, and so definitely check that out on our podcast recently. And so then that brought up a lot of questions, and um, Cameron, you gave some feedback about that episode. So I want to kind of maybe start there a little bit, and then kind of take it from there. Some of the things that a lot of people maybe don't remember about that event or those events, and things like that, and kind of what have been some of the long term impact of Occupy. Where do we go next? Is there a future? Is there something today that could be? It wouldn't look like Occupy, but sort of have the equivalent kind of impact, or I mean, it feels like we need something like Occupy now, but I don't know what that would look like. But yeah, so maybe we can start there a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to remember about Occupy is it was not just a New York thing in Zuccotti Park. It was global. So I was in Denver as part of Denver Occupy, and we were speaking to people in Philly, in New York. We were also speaking to people in Greece, in London. I mean, this really became a globalized thing. And I think it was and that was kind of my main criticism of their coverage, was I'm like, you're only focusing on like 1/100th of the protest. Like, it's not many times in human history where the entire world comes together to protest a common cause against a group of people. It's very emblematic of our globalized age. And also remember, this is 2011. Social media is still in its infancy. The smartphone is new. This is the first time a protest was live streamed. That was cutting edge technology at the time. The videos, the pictures, the coordination over social media at the time, that had not been done before. It's dead common now. It's 15 years later, but back then it was new at the time. And that's what made Occupy so kind of in your face, was that it wasn't just something you could ignore in a park somewhere. It was online, it was covered, all this type of thing. And there were pictures from people around the world sitting, living in tents in public spaces, demanding change from their governments, and really governments, everywhere. So that was kind of my big complaint as someone who wasn't involved in the New York protests. We have like, it not only was it nationwide, every major city in the US had an Occupy, but it was global. And that given that the financial crisis was, we were 3 years into the 2008 crisis and things really hadn't improved yet. And there were millions of people like me at my age, I was 23 at that time, who were kind of like, we went to school, we did everything right, we did what we were supposed to. Where's the jobs? Where's the entry level job? Where's the stuff? How do we start in life? And that was one of the reasons why I went down there. I went down there first as a journalist. I told my mom at the time, I said, this is probably the biggest protest movement of my generation. I should go be there, sort of things. And then I got involved because I learned all the ways in which the system had already failed people. What was new to me, and this is embarrassing, but it's true, I didn't realize it till the system failure reached me. And
Right.
that's for those that grew up in more modest circumstances that had been affected by structural poverty and all this type of thing for generations. At a certain point, that seems trite. It is, and I'll own that. The failure had reached someone like me from a upper middle class background, went to college, all this type of thing. And so that was what kicked Occupy off.
Yeah, well, and some of the people that talk about it that I've talked to that talk about how, like you talk about it, wait until it affected me. But for a lot of people, there was kind of the plural ignorance kind of idea that, well, I'm the only one that has this problem. I'm a
Yeah.
failure. I'm the only one who has overloaded student debt, or I'm the only one. And until you get in a situation like that, and everybody says, yeah, me too. Like everybody was kind of one version of me too back then. But you kind of realize that,
Yeah.
hey, I'm not the only one. And then this starts to look more like a systemic problem.
Well, I mean, the community aspect was huge. So when I first went down there, it was a lot of business owners. It was a lot of, we were in Denver and weed was becoming legal. We had medical at that time. It was a lot of cannabis entrepreneurs. It was a wide variety of people, but it was also a lot of college students who were sitting down there being like, hey, we went to school, we got degrees. Where are the jobs? Like of any real description sort of thing. And little did we know how bad it would get, but that that we then, so what really started out is then fortunately for a lot of us who just started asking questions, we found other people who were already into this, already studying it, already talking about it, and all of a sudden we were gifted with new knowledge, new language, for a lot of us a whole new understanding of the world that a lot of us had never really reached or engaged in before. And I know that sounds funny now, but this the current conversations we're having on wealth inequality, taxing the wealthy, all this type of thing, all trace back to that moment, because that was when we got the language. And let's not forget, we're 3 years into Obama. We're coming out of the Bush years, sort of thing. Um, and so, and also politically, things were a bit different. The Tea Party had happened by this time. Um, and we didn't really, I don't think in that moment realized how kind of difficult things were going to get. But I mean, let's also face it, Barack Obama ran on hope and change. They got healthcare done before the 2010 midterms. The Tea Party comes in, snatches away Congress from the Democrats, and the Obama agenda, such as it was, grinds to a halt and would not ungrind for the next 5 years. We didn't know that at the time, but so there's all these different factors kind of pouring in to this moment.
Well, and I think another piece of it that I remember, a lot of people were confused then, including me in some degree, and I think people are still confused about what the coalition was like. Because we always try to frame everything in Democrat, Republican, left, right, and Occupy was a weird movement that way. It had a lot of weird little strange bedfellows involved in it. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised that there's a fair number of people that were Occupy then that became Trump supporters, 5 years later.
I mean, look at the Bernie Bros pipeline.
Yeah.
I mean, for see also Bernie Bros. No, I mean, it's hard to think of it now with things so politicized the way they are. It was much less politicized back then. We were at the beginning of that wave, not the end of it. which I think we are at the end of it now. But we were at the beginning of that wave of polarization. The Tea Party had only gotten into power the November before. So we were just at the beginning of that. So things were not as polarized. So it didn't really matter if you were a Democrat, if you were a Republican. And especially in Denver, we kind of made a big deal about that because the agenda was not about politics. The agenda was about economics and structural and systemic change.
Well, and that's what I'm saying was I think unique about it, and I think it's still like that message is the part that we kind of need today to build some kind of coalition like that because it didn't work for media. Like media couldn't figure out how to position it, right? Because
Yes.
it's not
Well, and
left,
also
it's not, yeah.
and there was no management of the media narrative by anyone in the movement worldwide, and that was probably the biggest problem. Is the media thought this was kind of a joke and funny, and the complete lack of media training and media interaction made that worse. And on top of that, this was a decentralized leaderless movement where anyone who was speaking to the media, the first thing they would say is, I only speak for myself and not everyone here. So
Which the
they
media doesn't know
couldn't.
what to do with is part of the problem, right?
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with a leaderless movement where no one would step forward and speak for the collective. And Occupy was structured in such a way to avoid that very thing, ironically, because the politics of the people there were as variable as the people there. So the whole agenda was no one speaks for me but me, but we're going to act as a collective. The media had no clue how to cover that or how to engage with it in a intellectually and emotionally honest way on its own terms. They still can't do that, by the way.
Well, right. I mean, yeah, exactly. That you're right. And that's an ongoing problem. Like for any kind of decentralized movement, it has its it has its benefits and challenges, right? I mean, and that media communication is one of them. And even for just the people to understand it, like unless there's sort of a message, then everybody discounts it because, well, what are you guys trying to achieve?
Yeah, and that was, I think, one of the reasons I think the Tea Party became a political movement and Occupy never did was because there was never a clear list of demands. A lot of the demands and things that were talked about were very heady, they were very intellectual, they were very big. It was, we are the 99%. It was tax the rich. That's the first time that phrase enters the popular lexicon in this century. It really comes from the 1930s, but in our sort of universe of the last several decades, this is when it enters the lexicon. um and so, yeah, it was, that also I think was a bit confusing because there wasn't oh, we want these exact things changed. The ambitions were a lot bigger. The ambitions were systemic against the banks and banking. It was, we want, basically the real demand was, we want an economy that works for everybody, and that starts with jobs, with healthcare. It starts with, freedom, certain freedoms, especially around drugs, substances, healthcare, all this type of thing. In that motley crew, you had all these people bringing kind of all these different ideas of what the new system could look like based upon how the old system was, to use the term, oppressing them. And so any list of demands would be quite long, but the ones at the top of the list, I think, were really structural economic issues. That doesn't fit well in a 30-second soundbite for TV.
Yeah, and also people can get it can well, and it does fit in a soundbite some way. The only way it fits in a soundbite is kind of in a negative way, right? You can discount it. You can say that's they're being silly, they're extreme, they're radical. You know,
And that's
um,
exactly what happened, incidentally. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's like what happened is because it wasn't something small, simple, practical that you could just sort of pass a law or write a regulation on. No one was taking it seriously when we were kind of like, no, no, the big banks just went to taxpayers, got $800 billion. This is 2 years post TARP. You know, the banks just got bailed out for crashing the whole economy. And we're sitting here being like, maybe we shouldn't allow that anymore. Maybe we should bring these people to heel, sort of thing. Nowadays, I could say that on Facebook and it's unremarkable. At that time, it was revolutionary and nobody knew how to cover it.
well, you say that, but you could say it and it would be unremarkable. But at the same time, it there isn't things haven't gotten any better. Like if you could probably call up a recording of the things people were saying in the callbacks that were happening
Yeah.
in a Occupy protest, and you wouldn't know if it was then or now.
Yeah, I mean, I have some pictures and some video from that time, and it looks as prescient today as it was all those years ago. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's this. I think the one, and I've made this comparison. The Tea Party was very, and I was inside both, so I got to see both from the inside. The Tea Party was very good at co-opting the Republican Party very early on. I started running a Tea Party magazine in the spring of 2009, and the agenda from the jump was to unseat incumbent Republicans because they voted for too many Democrat policies, and they wanted Republicans to represent Republican values in Washington. That was the Tea Party agenda, and they did an excellent job literally in 2 years of going from a fringe group of like sovereign citizens and whatnot to a basically the Republican Party by 2011, 2012, and winning races at all levels and all this sort of thing. And I think it was because the agenda was different. The Tea Party agenda was let's fix the Republican Party. The Occupy agenda was let's fundamentally change the American economy, the global economy, really.
Well, and I know that the two may I don't know what the connection is or not, but I think there's some parallels in kind of how the media is handling it and other things with sort of the DSA movement, right? Um,
Yeah,
and in one sense, you see things like people saying, well, some of these democratic socialist candidates are so extreme and they want to like look at and I know some of the culture war stuff, but let's set that aside for a second and talk about some
right,
of these larger kind of policy things they've talked about, like, oh, let's end the Senate, or let's end the Electoral College. And that'll then be just thrown out as a radical idea. And it is a
right.
radical idea, I guess, or it's a pretty radical thing to consider, but it's like to just it's not any more radical than say Project 20, the stuff in Project 2025, um, and Project 2025 and some of its kind of adjacent other plans and programs. They're a different kind of model. Like Project 2025 is like, here's our sort of quasi legal to achieve these 55 things, and some of
Yeah,
them I would go beyond quasi legal and I'd say they are extra legal, but they have a strategy. Like, we're going to use the executive. We think there's all these loopholes in our current system to be able to achieve all these things. Now they're finding out some of them are not making it to the courts and they're getting challenged and yeah. But
yeah.
it's equally extreme with a different kind of agenda to achieve it. Whereas I think the idea of saying end the Senate, well, there's no even quasi legal to do that way to do that, right? I mean, that would be, you know, short of, again, it wouldn't be legal to have a dictatorship and somehow just do that. But a conversation about should we end the Senate, I think is perfectly fine. Like, it's time to start having some big conversations like that. So the only thing
No, I
end
mean,
the Senate is saying
yeah.
is it's a thing we want to talk about. So is it radical as a concept? Yes. Is it the right answer? I don't know, but I have no problem having a conversation about that.
Yes, I mean, I think it challenges one of the basic assumptions we have about the modern constitutional system that didn't really exist before about the 1970s, and that was that the Constitution is some immutable, God-given document that we can never change. That comes out of the Christian nationalist evangelical movement, and it does something politically very clever in that it basically calcifies political institutions into place that can never be challenged, never be updated, never changed, never made more responsive, all this type of thing. I mean, the change of picking senators by direct election instead of by state legislature was a huge change. It changed the nature of state elections and it changed the nature of the Senate, and we went almost 100 years more than before we did that. um and nowadays that would be unthinkable, and there are some people who want to go backwards. There are people talking about trying to repeal, I think it's the 21st amendment that does that. Trying to repeal that. No, it was before, in the 19th century. if the women to vote was 19, it must be 17 or 18. Like there is a movement to try to reverse that amendment. Like this is, but we have had this idea that all of a sudden this is an immutable thing that we can never move, we can never change, we can never fix, that we're stuck with forever. And incidentally, the Occupy was also questioning these same
Right.
big
Exactly.
assumptions, these big forces, sort of thing, and
And
saying,
that's the
does it
parallel that I
have to
see.
be
Yeah.
this way? Yeah, I was sir, I was going back to your parallel idea. Yeah, to be like, does it really have to be this way? And I think that's probably the big difference politically between Democrats and Republicans right now. Republicans, being conservatives that they are looking for small, specific, incremental changes to how government works. And that's what Project 2025 is. It's adjusting this department, changing. They're not asking for anything that huge. They're just defund this, get rid of that, gut education, all this everything. But it's government admin. It's why it's uninteresting and why they get away with it. Nobody wants to really dig into the details. Whereas over on the DSA side and back at Occupy, and a lot of your modern DSA types started out in Occupy, looking at you, AOC. Looking at you, Bernie Sanders. We took you from a nobody senator from Vermont to a national political figure. Thank you. Um, sort of thing. Um, Whereas these movements from the left, be it Occupy, the DSA movement now in the midterms, they're asking much bigger questions. And we've done this for a while. Defund the police. Great political slogan, terrible policy. But it's questioning, these fundamental structural ways in which society works. I think that's really hard for people to comprehend. And I think that's
Well, and we
one
haven't
of these
really.
was more successful than the other, and I think that's why.
Well, and that's the challenge going forward. Are we stuck forever with incremental changes? The only thing we can do. I mean, and I get it that people haven't seen like a serious debate on a big thing like that in how many
Yeah.
generations? It's been a while, right? But you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
a conversation, I mean, a true deliberation, that actually has experts and, and you really figure out what the trade-offs are, and you look at it not as a in a some if you can get above sort of just looking at it as a partisan story, but look at it as what are the real trade-offs of that. A conversation about ending the Senate might come up with some other kind of reforms or ideas that you could think about that would then be able to get the backing of a coalition behind it, and maybe that's a coalition that talks about how this helps the 99%, for instance, and doesn't frame it just in a
Yeah.
red, blue, left, right, Republican, Democrat. I mean, you know, I'm so frustrated about the fact that we can't have those kind of deliberations, or it's really hard to have them. They are happening in some places. They don't get much news coverage, but you know, so when somebody just discounts these big ideas, like in the Senate, it sounds pretty radical, right? In the Senate, like you think the guy's just going to come in as a dictator and end the Senate. That's not going to happen. That's not how it works. You can't do that. But if you could just
Yeah.
begin a deliberation around some of those big ideas, whether it's end the Senate, and I know we've had lot of conversations over generations and decades and centuries about ending or changing the electoral college. Same kind of thing. If we had real deliberation about that and say like, well, why is it the way it is, and what is the benefit of it, and what are the good parts, and if you're going to have a new idea, what's the better, why is that better, and how does it still accommodate some of the reasons why we had it to begin with, and but we just aren't able to have those kind of conversations where we can pull out the real trade-offs and try not to frame it as just who wins in terms of a left, right, red, blue thing, but framing it as who wins or the 99% versus the 1% or some other kind of framing and that's what I, feel like you even said Occupy was kind of a left movement, which I guess it got characterized that way, but was it really? Because Democrats certainly didn't love it. And
No.
Occupy didn't love
No.
Democrats, right? I mean, Occupy is kind of a lot. There's a lot of Occupy people that are sort of pissed off at Bernie and feel like he co-opted Occupy, and he's not the only one, and some others
Yeah.
as well. So, Occupy to me, I think when we try to frame it as left right, we're not giving it its due.
I mean, I view Occupy as a left wing thing because that economic populism didn't exist on the right yet at that time. That and the given the nature and demographics of who was there, what was being talked about, a lot of the rituals, a lot of the protest modalities and things like that tended to come out of left wing activism. Um, I will say, at least in the case of Denver, and I think this was true in other cities we interacted with at the time, a lot of the more conservative people involved in the protest bled off kind of early.
Hmm.
So we were there for in situ in the park for 9 months or so, and I would say by month 3 or 4, most of the conservative crowd had kind of split off. And by the time I stopped going and people started to really bleed off, it was being run by communists and anarchists. So what started off as maybe a center left sort of protest movement just got progressively more to the left, to socialism and communism, sort of by its end. But I would also remind everybody, the aftermath of Occupy tells a story. A lot of those parks and public places were fenced off afterwards for years. It was billed as grass rehabilitation or to prevent unruliness. There were places in Oklahoma that were fenced in for 5 years. The park we were in, City Park in Denver, they had the grass fenced off, I think, until 2013. It was 2 years. That doesn't just happen. It's like the pandemic. Very rarely does government take that overt of a move, which I think tells us Occupy was starting to be onto something. And they were really afraid, especially in Denver, that once the snow went away and good weather come back, the protests would restart the following year. The fencing, which was something that happened nationwide and worldwide, was really to prevent there being a resurgence of that protest the following year. And I think it that tells me people in government were more worried about this than maybe any of them wanted to admit at the time.
And do you think that's because of the on the ground, I mean, the idea of literally Occupy meant that there was this kind of on the ground network in all the informal kind of connections and communications, and that people could share their real stories, not like how the press or media want to manipulate it? Or what do you think? Because why couldn't you just do an Occupy without occupying, I guess, is kind of what I'm saying. What was the
Yeah.
difference of having tents and people physically there?
I think that so as Occupy was coming to an end, there was that question. What happens next? Because in Denver, we had a weather reality. It's cold and snowy, and it starts about Halloween. So, unlike other places like Greece and whatnot, we had this weather reality kind of bearing down on us. I'm sure it was great to protest in Barcelona. But we had this weather reality coming at us. And the reality is, we felt like occupying public space, even though we weren't supposed to. And I spent a lot of time arguing with the fire marshal about how this protest was going to go and all this type of thing. Um, and I think for us that was the protest. We're here. We're out here. You don't get to ignore us. We're not going away. We're not gonna hit 5, 6 o'clock and hit a diner. No, no. We're gonna be here when you drive by at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 2 p.m. We're here always, and we ain't leaving. That was the protest. And so I think it was really hard, and this is one of the reasons why it didn't have the same lasting impact as the Tea Party, is that it was really hard to keep that energy and keep that going without that physical occupation of space. And that's why the fences went up. That's why I said the aftermath tells the story, especially in more red, more conservative places. I think a lot of people in power were genuinely terrified. I mean, we had a riot at the state capitol, people banging on the brass doors, all this type of thing. We had people, really, you know, really, doing some crazy stuff. I watched a guy get arrested for being in a tent after they banned tents, and watch him carried off in his tent into the back of a police car in front of my face. 10 feet from me. I think some people in power got very, very terrified that if this grew, this continued, and people kept occupying these sorts of outdoor spaces, that things would get out of control. And I think that was acutely felt in Zuccotti Park because of its position and where it was. And the fact that it was in the financial district in New York, and it was a constant daily reminder of the inequality and the unbalance of what had happened. And I think it was also doubly true in other parts of the world, especially, what happened to Greece after the 2008 crisis was absolutely terrible. Um, but I think that physical occupation was just so important to the whole movement.
Yeah, like you say, that kind of signals that like maybe they were onto something. And what does that
Yeah.
say for a new movement now? I mean, do you think the institutions learned more from Occupy than the protesters did? In other words, they kind of know now. Next time we just shut this thing down quietly right away and try to have it not have much media. Because part of what made Occupy interesting was some of the reaction to it, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
helped it might not have got on the map that much if it was just 100 people in Zuccotti Park. But as it was like on the news and you're seeing police pepper spray people and stuff like that, now people are
Yeah.
like, hey, what's going on over there?
Well, and yeah, and I think that was, I mean, especially like Zuccotti Park was of the national protests, one of the smaller ones actually. It got a lot of press because of where it was. That was their thing. But the reality is that protest was never that large. It, Zuccotti's Park peak was a slow night in Denver. It was a slow night in Philly. It was a slow night in Oklahoma City. A lot of these, and you get it international in London, it was thousands, not hundreds, thousands. Same thing with a lot of other capitals of Europe. It was way bigger in other places, other cities. And so, yeah, I mean, if you're, an empowered person and a creature of the institutions of power, and people start, sitting outside, I mean, never forget, I mean, what started out as people holding signs at LAX for Vietnam vets coming back from Southeast Asia pretty quickly turned into a protest movement ending a war. And a lot of people, like my mother and others, are still very much alive to remember how the Vietnam War protest ended the Vietnam War. And so I think there was a lot of people in power who were very afraid that this was going to be that again, and they weren't going to get bitten in the butt twice on this one. And so I think that also was part of the reason why the fences went up afterwards, and why things happened the way they happened. However, it's not just power. Occupy did kind of eat itself from the inside. As it turns out, it's really hard to have a leaderless, decentralized movement. It's really hard to get political aims and goals when you're not really aligning with a political party. The DSA learned that lesson. Notice they're not dumb. They're running as Democrats, just like Bernie did. They've learned their lesson on that one. There was also it was also, I think, difficult to do this without any real funding, without any real backing. It was really this organic people just really coming together sort of thing. And cities didn't know what to do with it at first, states didn't know what to do with it at first. But I think, it's not every day people go outside and start demanding, we have to tax the rich, stop subsidizing banks, stop subsidizing airlines and major corporations. As Scott Galloway would later say, we privatize the gains and socialize the losses, all this sort of thing. But I mean, that whole conversation, the reason we even talk about stuff like that is because of Occupy. And honestly, that's why, honestly, never was a left wing movement more politically useless, but culturally shifting, which is such an emblematic thing of the American left. It's like very rarely do we get political power to change stuff, but when it comes to changing culture and conversations, we are the best. Which Republicans find very frustrating, by the way. But I mean, you have this sea change of culture and conversation that completely changes what happens, how it happens, what we talk about it, how we think about the economy. It was the reason I started the Cameron Journal. It was the reason I started writing about capitalism. There was a whole generation of us that started writing and thinking about these things because of what happened at Occupy. Occupy's influence on American political life reaches to this day. People have long forgot about the protest movement, except when we talk about it on Outrage Overload. But the cultural effect of it has been hugely profound. And I think the current DSA movement, because so many of the millennials in charge started out at Occupy, they're doing things differently. We figured out 15 years ago what doesn't work, and we now know what does work. And the Democratic Party is having its Tea Party moment. They're going through now what the Republican Party went through in 2010, 2012, 2014, heading into 2016. Now, if you are like me, a liberal person who's ready to vote for somebody else in 2028, um, this is great news. And it could, host a sea change of a Democratic Party that's not beholden to corporate interests and is actually interested in proposing real policy solutions that actually help people. Crazy, I know. Um, but that all kind of ties back to that common thread. It just took way longer.
Well, and also, so I mean, are we saying there's sort of a through line from Occupy to this DSA movement?
Absolutely. A lot of the people in charge of these campaigns and who are active in this movement started out in Occupy. I think a lot of the moves they're making are learned lessons from Occupy. They're not trying to stand outside the system and critique both parties and all this type of thing. They're running as Democrats to push the Democratic Party farther left because they've realized it's very, very hard to fund elections and fund seats and beat the money power of the two major parties. I don't love that we live in a two-party binary that anyone else does. Our electoral system optimizes for it. We can't change that. So I think to some degree, they've learned the lesson of, yeah, you do have to some degree get into the system to tear it apart. That's what the Tea Party did to the GOP. And by the way, Trump does not even get considered in 2016 without the Tea Party getting into power first. Trump
Well, and
does
that's
not
another.
happen in 16 without the Tea Party. But let's also think about, but if we draw that comparison again, what comes of 2028 for the DNC when you have senators, Congress people? I mean, we're living in the Republican Party 2009. Give it, when and we they had to wait 8 years for Barack Obama to get out to vote someone new, and they voted for a populist, Donald Trump. We have 2 years to do this, to vote for something radically different in 2028 that's not another consultant optimized, mealy mouthed corporate Democrat. And so that makes 2028 very exciting in terms of what policies get really proposed and how the party is basically going to get forced to change over the next couple of years heading into the 28 presidential election.
Well, there's a lot of people. Well, you see, well, and I also see, though, I mean, for one thing, obviously the DNC is very, very scared about that.
Yes, they
But
are.
another parallel there is that people are definitely, you see very much a lot of journalists and sort of just criticism that is basically trying to delegitimize, and usually they pick a lot of cultural things. And like I say, they'll take a statement like "end the Senate" and say, "See how ridiculous these people are," and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
they're doing some of the same kinds of stuff that they, kind of did with Occupy, about trying to, kind of make the whole thing out into as if it's kind of just a ridiculous movement. So you're seeing some of this happening, and I don't know if I blame, sort of the DSA for not learning that lesson, or is there a better way to manage the media, or are we just stuck with that? That's the way the media is.
I think we're stuck with that's the way the media is because the Republican side has just as much crazy stuff, but it never gets framed that way. Mostly because, well, there's twofold. One, Republicans are very good at keeping themselves distance from their crazies. The left has never done that. Um, and but you also, here's the reality. Yeah, and the Senate may seem extreme. So are many of the restrictive abortion laws being passed in states all over the country. So is the idea that brown people and women should not get military promotions. Thank you, Pete Hegseth. So is Christian nationalist policies that are enforcing a white male Christian worldview on the country or trying to reintroduce the Bible and Christianity into schools and this type of thing. That's just as extreme, but the media never frames it that way. Notice that. Like that's then this is where we get into how things are framed, how narrative is created and withdrawn, and how things get talked about, which is why I always say when I would do the Cameron Journal, there's a delta between how we talk about things and their reality, and I'd always try to live in the middle of that. This is another one where how these things get talked about rather than their reality gets very important. Take the end of the Senate thing. Here's the reality. Our national legislature is way too small for a country of our size. The House of Commons in Britain, for a country of 68 million people, has 1,500 people in it. We have 435 for a nation of 310 million people. We could triple the House and get much better representation and still kind of be understaffed.
And I love the
Each
reason for it
state
is
get
because the building isn't big enough.
and the reason it was fixed after the ascension of Arizona in 1912 was because it was the technology of the time made it hard to manage a lot of people, so they fixed it at 435. But I mean, yeah, we might need to do some building renovations. Boo hoo. Like, Trump just tore down half the White House to build a ballroom. I think we can come up with some clever ways to make this Capitol building a bit bigger, sort of thing. Like, I mean, this is the conversation that's happening and going on. But the reality is our national legislature is too small. The Senate is fixed at 2 senators per state, which means you living in California are less represented in the Senate than someone in Wyoming. How do we fix that? Well, we can make the Senate proportional. Do we really need to? Probably not. Therefore, you have this idea of let's get rid of the Senate, because the reality is if you have the lower chamber being larger and no upper chamber, so you'd end up like Nebraska with a unicameral legislature, you would end up with legislation passing a lot faster. A lot of stuff, both sides, dies in the Senate because of how that institution works and the fact that, especially in our polarized age, a lot of things hinge on 1 or 2 votes. Most of Biden's agenda got sunk not by Republicans, but by people in his own party. Thank you, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, sort of thing. And I think there's a real frustration with these institutions.
Well, yeah, exactly. And that's where I'm not saying you and I can solve it here or that I know what the answer is, but I think the debates and the deliberation, the serious deliberation about these kinds of things, the time has come. Like we need to start having those kind of conversations and not just discount it as
Yes.
some crazy idea and not just accept it as, yeah, we'll just do that. Right. I think you have to have those deliberations where we can draw out those trade-offs and come up with and the idea from that. I mean, we know sort of there's a lot of research and science on this, that if you get, enough smart people in the room, and they don't have to be that smart, just average Americans combined with quality information, they can deliberate and arrive at a set of trade-offs that are better, and we come up with something that's better than the way it works now. And to be afraid of that,
Yeah.
is where, like you said earlier, that because it's some, sacrosanct thing that we can't touch.
Well, and there's also a bit of kind of failed strategy here. Republicans are very good at, going around to state legislatures and getting resolutions passed for a constitutional convention. There's one going right now that only needs 2 more states to pass, sort of thing. But the mainline Republican Party never, ever talks about this publicly. It's very behind the scenes. It's very, in the back rooms. No national GOP ever talks about it, never hits right wing media, or if it does, it's online, very fringe. But these things have real impact, and they have the potentiality of really happening. And we'll wake up one day and find out, oh, wait, they're having a constitutional convention. When did that happen? Quietly behind the scenes. And this is where the left kind of shoots itself in the foot. We come out with a great slogan and we go hard with that slogan, and the Senate, defund the police, Black Lives Matter, all this type of thing. And the political goals of that never get achieved because it immediately becomes a polarizing subject framed through the media. So we never actually get to have, to your point, the conversation of, is this a good idea? We then end up, so we stop talking about the reality and we start talking about the language being used, what it actually means, what that represents. And it basically does the right wing GOP ad writing for them, because then all they have to do is promote us as a bunch of crazies who want to do crazy things. And it completely kills any of the political goals from the jump.
So if anybody on the chat, has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Um, what wh- what are some of your takeaways about, we've kind of interleaved them in the conversation so far, but do you have anything specific that you want to make sure we talk about, either like a through line from Occupy, some way that Occupy is influencing things right now, or some way you think it should influence things right now?
Yeah, it's always cool to get questions and different perspectives and all this. I mean, Occupy was a very diverse movement with a lot of diverse people. I think a lot of the social justice warrior woke DEI stuff also came out of that. And really, I think to some degree the SJW woke DEI stuff almost was the heir to Occupy on cultural issues. Um, Economically, nothing really ever happened. And part of that was because the Obama administration never engaged with the movement in any serious way, or even engaged with the ideas in any serious way, which, given the person that Obama is, kind of makes sense. Obama was never going to engage in something like that. But I think on the culture war stuff, I think a lot of people thought there was something where we could win, where we could really win, sort of thing. And we could really get something going. And to some degree, I think that was true. I think a lot of people took it way too far and thought we were much closer to a permanent cultural revolution than we really were. But the reality is, for the next several years, really up until very recently, you had a cultural dominance of these ideas that changed government, it changed society, it changed corporate America, it changed a lot of things, and now we're living in the backlash of it, interestingly enough. So, and to some degree, you also see the environmental movement being the heir of the Vietnam War movement. You all, sort of, I mean, sometimes out of these things you get other things that trace their origins back, and the arc of the social justice warrior into woke, into DEI, and now the denouement of that, has its roots deeply in Occupy. And we never forget, a lot of this was a reaction to the Bush years. A lot of this stuff in the early 2010s does not make sense if you do not understand the Bush years. And I have younger friends who were in elementary school, middle school, didn't really understand the Bush years, didn't hit high school till about Obama got in, sort of thing. Um, and I had to explain, it's like they were invading Iraq in 2000. We were already protesting. Okay, so like people were already mad about it, and the troops hadn't even left yet. To understand, and then the lies come out and all this sort of thing, and what happens in '05. Like, a lot of people don't understand that, a lot of stuff was a reaction. Barack Obama was a reaction to the Bush years. The Democrats could have run a ham sandwich in 2008 and won. They happened to get a generational talent, but they literally could have run a ham sandwich. Sort of thing. You have to understand the historical context of these things. These things don't happen in a vacuum, not by far.
Yeah. So if I have, if we, as we talked about earlier, like the whole I think the strongest or the most durable thing that's come out of Occupy is the 99%, 1%, kind of meme, and that holds
Absolutely.
us up. And I think it has opportunity to be bipartisan or whatever, sort of build a bigger tent kind of thing. Um, we can answer Nancy's question as well. The But I think that's really a durable thing, and I think that's still something that has legs for trying to build some kind of a coalition around. And what I mean, I have no idea what that might look like, though, right? I mean, in my dream,
Yeah.
we're all in a park somewhere, and we got red hats, we got blue hats, we got all these hats, and we're still kind of unified around this one thing. But
Yes.
what do you think? All all the stuff, especially on the economy side, that Occupy was talking
Yeah.
about, are not any better. Like
Yeah.
the same, they're just the
No.
same. Like if not
Much
worse,
worse.
worse.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
like, what would an Occupy type thing even look like today? Do you think, or do you not? I kind of have no idea, but maybe you have some ideas.
I mean, I think to some degree that time has passed. I think I don't necessarily think, and this actually gets into Nancy's question. I'm going to circle back to it right now. This also kind of loops into the stakes are much higher now. Most people at Occupy, even though we did have to deal with the cops and the police and people got arrested a lot, we were not getting attacked by dogs. We were not getting shot in the road. We were a lot of things that have happened in Minnesota and elsewhere with ICE. Those things were not happening at that time. We were not in fear of secret police. They showed up in uniformed cars, in uniforms with lights ablaze. I think right now it would be very, very hard to get people to hit the streets because they did in Minnesota, and that's how Alex Preddy got shot. And a lot of people looked at him as he got what he deserved. I have friends that think that was a totally, completely fine use of police force, all this type of thing. Same thing with Renee Gooden in her car. And I'm have my own thoughts about that. I do not agree with many of my friends on a variety of topics. That is one. I'm kind of like when your government is shooting your fellow citizens in the street, that's usually not a good thing. History doesn't look favorably on that. Sort of thing. But I think a lot of the community movements in Minnesota, the mutual aid networks,
Yeah,
the
so
Facebook
I'll just let
groups,
me just
things
kind of
like
read
that.
Nancy's thing so we make sure we have it
Yeah,
out there.
yeah, go
So
ahead.
in the
Yeah.
replay, people know what we're talking about. So she says,
Yeah.
I'm deeply impressed with the way the folks in Minneapolis work together to challenge ICE and protect their immigrant communities. And I would agree with that. And also, that was another group that was very mixed. That wasn't just all lefties or whatever, right? There
Yeah,
was a lot
yeah.
of just blue collar kind of workers, folks in that. So anyway, and there
Yeah.
and then she asked, there are current they are the current model for change. How are they related to Occupy? So that's kind of the question that you're kind of answering.
Yeah, no, no. It's I think a lot of the community, well, one, Minneapolis has a historical rootedness in community organizing that not every city has. There's also the upper Midwest, because it was settled by Scandinavian people, has a level
Mhm.
of cultural solidarity that is very different from a lot of the rest of the country. So there's some historical stuff that helps there. But the reality is, a lot of the local organizations that make this possible sometimes have roots in Occupy, people who were involved in Occupy. The language, particularly how to talk about these things, what to do, all this type of thing. A lot of that comes out of Occupy. A lot of the people who are, doing the community organizing, doing the protest organizing, this type of thing, they've copied Occupy, they've copied the protests in Hong Kong. And thanks to the internet now, this knowledge is freely available and oftentimes distributed or can be found. We have Facebook groups now, we have secure messaging, which we didn't have a lot of those things back then. We have the smartphone is much more common and people are on it all the time. That wasn't as true in 2011 as it is now. Um, all of those things kind of create that. I think Occupy, for a lot of people, especially people of my age and generation, were our first opportunity learning that language, figuring out that language, learning how to do it, how to protest. I'm now 38 years old. So if you were 20, if you're in your early 20s to Occupy, guess what? You probably maybe have a house, you maybe have kids, all this type of thing. But you know what you didn't forget how to do? Occupy a protest and go outside. And so I think a lot of that community organizing by people, in the road, who, if you notice, they're all about my age, maybe a little older, all this type of thing, is because a lot of us have real on the ground protest experience from our early days. The boomers did this after Vietnam. They're really good at protesting because they spent a lot of their teens and 20s protesting Vietnam. And that would pay dividends for decades in Greenpeace, the environmental movement, political changes through the Reagan years into the Clinton years. Most of the people you saw protesting the Iraq War were my mom's age because they know how to go outside and protest against a war. You now have that same thing with a lot of millennials. We know how to get outside and get a protest going. We know how to do, voiceover, voice comms with no microphone, people's mic sort of stuff. You don't forget that knowledge. You'd know how to do it. And so I think that's where the connection to Occupy is, and why Minneapolis was particularly resilient to a lot of that stuff. But also, shout out to Minneapolis. They have great community organizing and they have a unique history of it that is not as present elsewhere.
Another thing that I saw that was a big parallel. Now I don't know if there's a direct line from what people that were associated with Occupy to what was going on in Minneapolis, but another parallel there was the mutual aid stuff, right? I mean, that's one thing
Yes.
Occupy really got right was that mutual aid part, and that continued. There's a lot of spin-offs after Occupy, after the initial Occupy, of these different organizations that were from the same, like you said, the same people that were part of Occupy that formed some of these mutual aid groups. And I think some of that carries
Yeah.
into what I saw in Minneapolis.
And it also, that language, that phrase, people know what it means now. They may not necessarily be learning in the particulars of how a mutual aid thing works, but if you say, "Oh, we're starting a mutual aid group," people have a basic idea of what that is, and they may or may not want to contribute to it. That comes from Occupy too. I mean, so even if you weren't involved in the protest, you maybe got the language, you got the ideas that, yeah, this is what this phrase means. And if someone says this, no, that's crazy leftist stuff, or yeah, I want to get involved, sort of thing. And I think also it's desperation. People in 2011, we weren't as desperate yet. A lot has changed in the intervening 15 years. And this, I think now, people who would have never joined up a mutual aid Facebook group are doing so now, not because they're that excited about mutual aid. They need help. And they're willing to do whatever they can to get the help because institutions are not doing it anymore. And to some degree, the Trump administration is even kind of driving this forward by cutting back on food stamps, putting work requirements on Medicaid, volunteer requirements, things like this. Um, all of this stuff, they are, really driving people into, if you can't access something, humans in our natural brains will find a way around it. Ask anyone who grew up in the old Soviet Union or lived under communist rule. People will find a way around it. And I think a lot of that now is because people need the help. They don't have an option this time. Things aren't okay enough anymore. And I think why now is such a big inflection point for so much of this stuff. If anything, Occupy was early. We needed to wait a decade, really. Because the people weren't desperate enough back then. You still could get a small job somewhere. Things were a lot cheaper. You could still afford stuff on a low, whatever have you. People weren't now, unless in a K-shaped economy, unless you're in the upper K, and we're talking maybe the top 20% of people, if you're in the bottom of the K, which is 80% of people, times are getting desperate. Have you seen the price of cars lately? Price of housing, price of food, price of healthcare, all this type of thing. I actually got quoted new healthcare today. It was $300 a month, and I was thrilled. I was like, oh my goodness, cost savings. I should sign up. That's where we've come to. $100 even at Aldi, which is a cheap grocery store, don't get you much. For me, it's 4 bags. Like, sort of thing. Like, when I was in college, if I'd had $100 to spend on food, I would have spent 20, 30 of it on booze and still gotten a huge grocery haul, that would have fed me and all my friends for quite some time. Nowadays, it's snacks, a few staples, some tomato goods, some bread products, and that's it. Even if I go and get it myself, sort of thing. Like, I think a lot of it's, people are a lot more desperate. And I think now that's why this is happening. And this happened before in the 1930s with Upton Sinclair and the socialist movement in the 1930s. I was just telling my buddy about this. The reason why we got social programs in the 1930s was because the economy absolutely crumbled and fell apart. And we were at many times days away from a communist revolution. Right after World War One, between 1919 and about 1922, there was a big threat of a communist revolution, and there was another one in the mid 1930s. And I think now we're getting to a place where voters are receptive to DSA policies because they don't have a choice. Things aren't okay enough anymore. It's time for a change.
All right. Well,
I
well,
mean,
with that,
basically what I'm saying is it took Occupy 15 years to finally get some political goals going. We just needed to cook for a minute. Like, I mean, we were young. A lot of us were very young. We were very new. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know how to solve all these problems. We didn't have all the policy prescriptions. But here's the reality. It's been 15 years. We're older. We're wiser. We know how stuff works now. And we've reached this inflection moment. And I think that's why now what's happening politically is happening politically, and why even what's happening in your own town is happening the way it is. And I think it's everything. It's AI data centers. It's the cost of food. It's the cost of housing. You have all these things crashing together. And so when a candidate comes along and says, "Hey, maybe let's not let the rich get away with everything," which by the way is very bipartisan when polled, sort of thing. If there's one group everyone wants to go after, it's the wealthy. Democrat, Republican doesn't matter, sort of thing. Yeah, Occupy lit a fuse. It just took 15 years to explode. And I think we're about to see the first explosion in November, and I think we'll see another one in 2028. And honestly, at this point, if we want this country to continue, we have to change. And as Winston Churchill was supposedly famous to say, America will do the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted. Well, we ran out of possibilities, so now it's time to do it. Now it's time.
Awesome.
So,
Well,
yeah.
Cameron Cowan, so much. Thanks so much for joining us today. Sorry, I got stuck in traffic. It took me a while to get the live started, but
No, it's okay. You were playing with the grandchildren. That's always more important than sitting around talking about a 15-year-old protest movement. So it's
yeah,
family
yeah,
memories last forever. So,
yeah. Good
but
advice. All right, Cameron. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it, and thanks everybody for joining. And we'll get this replay up, and so everybody can check it out afterwards. And if you have other questions about it, you can always reach us at outrageoverload.net. Cameron, do you have a place people can find you?
yeah. If you have questions, comments, concerns, you can email me, Cameron at CameronCowan.net is a great way. And don't forget to check out my new Substack, Story, Strategy, and Signals. It's strategyandsignals.substack.com. I'm posting news signals, geopolitics, fun stuff like that. So that's the new place to follow me as we celebrate the end of the Cameron Journal and getting ready to sell. So, yeah.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'll have to go subscribe to that.
Yeah. So, but thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, great talking to you today, and thanks again.
Thank you, David. Bye bye.
Bye bye.